Day to order. The hearing is on defense mobilization. I'm pleased to welcome three witnesses to testify today. Jerry McGinn is a widely published former DoD official who worked at the heart of the Pentagon's industrial base efforts. Chris Michienzi brings a similar resume. She spent much of her career inside the Industrial Base Policy Office at DoD. And Dave Berteau comes to us from the Professional Services Council. Before that, he served as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Logistics and Material Readiness, early put industrial base revitalization. There seems to be an error here. And before that, he served as Assistant Secretary of Defense for Logistics and Material. Welcome to the witnesses. Senator Wicker, the chairman of the committee, is detained for a little bit, and when he comes, he will enter his testimony into the record. With that, I would like to recognize the ranking member, Senator Reed.
Oh, thank you very much, Senator Fisher, and I want to welcome our witnesses, Dr. Christine Michienzi, Dr. Jerry McGinn, and Mr. David Berteau. Thank you very much for joining us. This is a very important conversation, and we're fortunate to have such a distinguished panel before us. Throughout history, we have consistently seen nations with well-prepared militaries lose to nations with superior industries. The ability to deploy well-trained troops and advanced weapons to the front line is important in any armed conflict, but the ability to sustain those forces with adequate amounts of supplies and munitions is just as important. The Defense Acquisition University defines industrial mobilization as, quote, the process of marshaling the industrial sector to provide goods and services, including construction, required to support military operations and the needs of the civil sector during domestic or national emergencies. Put more simply, industrial mobilization represents the Defense Department's ability to call on the private sector in times of crisis. I am concerned that the United States is not currently prepared to do this effectively in a sustained, large-scale, or protracted conflict. The war in Ukraine and the incredible amount of military support we have provided has been vital for Ukraine's survival, but it has exposed our own industrial base vulnerabilities. We have learned that our capacity to produce vast amounts of artillery shells, precision munitions, and other modern weapons in a rapid, responsive way is much more limited than we realized. Our capacity has expanded significantly over the past 3 years, but we have relied on existing tools such as the Defense Production Act to overcome supply chain problems and increase production. Any future conflict we may face, particularly in the Indo-Pacific, will require much greater levels of military-industrial capacity, as well as interagency coordination to leverage a whole-of-government response. The process for large-scale mobilization dates back to the World War II era. When America entered the war, there was an enormous increase in military production of ships, planes, artillery, vehicles, and more, which eventually earned us the title as the arsenal of democracy. However, we must not forget that the industrial ramp-up actually began long before the war started and did not yield significant results until we were years into the fight. This is an important lesson we should remember today. Industrial mobilization does not occur overnight. Further, while we have a useful model from our experience in World War II, it is not a blueprint for the future. We must recognize the industrial base of today is very different from any period in the past, especially considering our reliance on information technology and software-based systems. We will need to mobilize different sectors of the economy and workforce unlike any time before. Moreover, we cannot assume, as we did in World War II, that our production facilities will be safe from kinetic or cyber attack, or that we will have uncontested supply lines for materials. I would ask our witnesses to discuss the lessons they have drawn from the war in Ukraine and what processes they believe need to start now so that the United States is prepared to win the next contest. This committee has spent years examining the challenge around these issues. We have worked to identify supply chain problems and improve investments in long lead items of the military. In recent National Defense Authorization Acts, Congress has directed the Department of Defense to stress test its industrial mobilization and supply chain capabilities. The The department has found a number of challenges, including integration of software and information technology, but it is clear that material and labor shortages are the biggest problems to increase production. Indeed, there is nothing more important for our defense mobilization strategy than our workforce, the men and women in the Defense Acquisition Corps and the personnel in the Defense Industrial Base. We cannot solve our industrial mobilization and acquisition problems without an adequate supply of skilled and trained workers. I would note that acquisition reform is necessary, but it is not sufficient to address the broader issues of industrial mobilization. In a crisis, having an acquisition system that is efficient and effective is important, but production capacity is far more so. Many of the policies and processes we put in place in peacetime for the sake of efficiency may actually be counterproductive in a prolonged crisis. That is why I'm so troubled by the mass firings of the defense civilian workforce and which the administration is undertaking right now. The urgency around these issues has never been clearer. As Russia continues its onslaught against Ukraine and China calculates its own potential expansion, we have to make sure our defense industrial base is able to adapt, scale, and outpace our competitors in the 21st century. And I would ask our witnesses' thoughts on how we might overcome this challenge and how we can ensure that the workforce in place is there to do so. Thank you again to our witnesses, and thank you, Senator Fisher.
Thank you, Senator Reid. Again, welcome to the panel. Dr. McGinn, you are recognized for your opening statement.
Thank you, Chairwoman Fisher and Ranking Member Reid and members of the committee. Good morning. It is a privilege to be here, and thank you very much for having this hearing on this important topic, which is critical facing the nation. The United States has the most lethal and capable fighting force in the world, full stop. But as we've seen in recent war games, as well as in challenges that the Senator Reid alluded to in production capacity for munitions, we have real industrial-based capacity challenges. So these challenges led me to do a study that addressed the following question. How well is the U.S. industrial base prepared to mobilize in the event of major conflict? The short answer, published in our report before the balloon goes up, is that our ability to win a major war with a near-peer competitor is very much at risk. Unless senior officials across Washington and industry pursue bold actions immediately, we face potentially catastrophic consequences should the balloon go up in East Asia or elsewhere. Drawing on historical and recent cases, we developed a series of recommendations to enable industrial mobilization. I'd like to focus on two areas specifically. One is the authorities and planning capabilities, and then secondly, our ability to scale. So in the area of authorities and plannings, as you all know very well, the government's ability to mobilize industrial base starts with our legal authorities and the policies and plans. The famous War Production Board of the Arsenal of Democracy in World War II helped organize government industry to address those challenges. Similarly, during the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, the development of the MRAP, the Mobile Mine-Resistant Ambush Protected Vehicle, the use of the Defense Production Act was critical to help produce those vehicles. And then we all felt saw the power of DPA during COVID. So overall, our legislative authorities are strong, but I think there are several opportunities before us. The first, as you know, DPA is up for reauthorization this year. DPA has had tremendous impact on rebuilding and reshoring industrial-based capacity, and it is essential to reauthorize DPA and keep it focused exclusively on national security issues, particularly threats from China. DPA Title III is an important tool for building industrial capacity. There would be the use of purchase commitments under Title III would be a great way to enable a strong demand signal for industrial capacity and capabilities such as specialty chemicals and critical materials. But currently, purchase commitments are not allowed, are not enabled because the DPA funds are being appropriated with procurement dollars which expire as opposed to traditional DPA appropriations which do not expire. And there's a real opportunity in another section of titles of the DPA, Title VII, where we have two sections of authority that haven't been used since the Cold War that are really powerful. One is Section 708, which allows the creation of voluntary agreements between government and industry that allows collaborative industry-government engagement on critical supply issues. If we were to we have a few of these available now, but if we were to really kind of invest in these efforts, we could have that collaboration we had during the War Production Board years. The second section is Section 710, which allows the creation of what's called a National Defense Executive Reserve, which is essentially a group of industry experts that can come into government during a crisis. So this is a tremendous authority that has not been used since the 1980s. So, and the other thing we need to do on the planning side is we have to restart mobilization planning. That ended in the early 1990s. We have to build this across the U.S. government, and then we also have to relook some of the executive orders that govern DPA. Now, transitioning from authorities to our capabilities, we really have to focus on turbocharging our efforts to change how we design, resource, acquire, and sustain capabilities. As the ranking member talked about, it's not just about acquisition reform, it's about how we buy. We have to design things for production. We have to focus less on requirements and have more adaptive ways to create technologies. We have to resource, we have to have more resources would be helpful, of course, but another way that we can go beyond appropriations is to really tap the power of U.S. capital markets is one of our strengths. So building on the authority that you all created with the Office of Strategic Capital, there's opportunities to grow the scale of investments so private capital can make larger bets in investments. On the areas of production, we've gotten the prototyping game down. I think that, but it's really now the time to transition more to production. And there are ways to do that through other follow-on production agreements, more buying of attritable systems and unmanned systems and the like. And then finally, the area of sustainment is frankly our biggest challenge, being able to do logistics at scale. And there we can actually do things like create contract line items or CLINs that develop surge capacity. So instead of having, canalized very limited supply runs, you can have the ability to grow that. And also second sourcing and multi-sourcing are important options to be able to create more capacity. One final point I'd like to make is on allies and partners. Our recent experience has made it crystal clear we need a larger industrial base, engaging our closest allies, those with whom we go to war through robust industrial partnerships will help us build overall capacity. Unfortunately, time is not on our side. If the Davidson window is correct, we have 2 years, and it takes a while, as this senator alluded to mobilize. The Trump administration and Congress, in partnership with industry and our allies and partners, must harness innovation, manufacturing capacity, and other means to unleash the true strength of our industrial base to deter our enemies in today's very dangerous world. The time to do this is now, before the balloon goes up. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. McGinn. Dr. Michienzi.
Thank you, Chairman Fisher, Ranking Member Reed, and distinguished members of the committee, for the opportunity to speak with you today on defense mobilization, which is essential for our nation's security. The defense industrial base necessary to build our DoD systems is fragile, but this fragility didn't happen overnight. Key decisions by the U.S. government and industry have played a very large role. For instance, decades-long private sector and public policy approaches to domestic production prioritize low, short-term costs over security, sustainability, and resilience. So the industrial base has become optimized for efficiency and not resiliency. Just-in-time deliveries versus inventories of long lead time items cut warehousing costs and increased efficiency, but limits industry's flexibility and responsiveness. And the DIB has many single and sole source suppliers due to the decades of consolidation. Often those are foreign adversarial sources that are cheaper but can introduce risk. At OSD, I was in the trenches of mobilization efforts for almost a decade. I was the lead for DoD for scaling up production for all of the weapon systems we were sending to Ukraine. A function I led for various crisis scenarios since 2017. I was also very involved in DoD's efforts in response to COVID-19, working with the interagency partners, using the Defense Production Authorities Jerry talked about, Titles 1, 3, and 7, to execute CARES Act funding to increase production of medical resources, including prioritization and allocation of supplies, which becomes important when we're trying to mobilize and surge, and providing financial support to DoD suppliers. As the United States is supporting two conflicts and preparing for potential conflict in the Indo-Pacific region, it has become clear that the DIB is not equipped to mobilize to support the existing activities, much less a competition with China. Although there are and continue to be multiple efforts aimed at mitigating shortfalls that support mobilization, there are some systemic issues and causal factors that are not being addressed. The most important of these is DoD's acquisition behavior. I'm not referring to acquisition reform here, such as different ways of doing contracting, but to the decisions that are made by the acquisition community that are the root causes of many of our supply chain issues. The industrial base is very seldom a consideration when most acquisition programs make certain decisions, such as increasing or decreasing procurement quantities, or even analysis during major milestone decisions. When mitigating supply chain issues, DoD is often treating the symptoms and not the cause. I'll highlight two representative examples, but there are many more I can elaborate on. The government is funding efforts to reshore and ally shore critical supply chains, and partners and allies are critical to solving this issue. However, if we don't bring demand back to those more secure sources, they will not survive. Even though DoD programs have the authority to direct sources of supply, they most often do not, letting industry choose. Because industry is profit-driven, they will almost always choose the cheapest source, which is unfortunately often a Chinese or other adversarial source or a more secure source. DoD reinforces this behavior by choosing the lower cost proposal among technically equal options. Industry will not risk losing a contract by using a higher cost supplier, even if that supplier is more secure. DoD also does not like to direct sourcing because it shifts the liability from industry to government if something goes wrong with that material or component. But if we are truly going to have secure suppliers for these critical items, DoD and other agencies, because DoD is often only 1 to 2% of the demand, should be required to use the U.S. or allied source if one of it is available that meets requirements, and also to incentivize industry to use those sources with policies such as price preferences and contract selection, for instance. Another example is one of the major constraints we faced when scaling production for weapon systems for Ukraine and other crises, and something that continually plagues DoD, which is obsolescence. The way DoD deals with obsolescence is reactive and ad hoc at best. With a few exceptions, programs do not plan or budget for obsolescence, choosing instead to wait until an obsolescence issue occurs to determine a mitigation plan and scramble to find funding to execute that plan before time runs out. Obsolescence was the main reason we couldn't make more Stinger and PAC-3 Patriot missiles when the Ukraine conflict started initially. Acquisition program managers and even service acquisition executives have told me they can't afford to budget for obsolescence, but many studies have shown that being proactive by planning and budgeting in advance saves time and cost. Programs should be required to plan and budget to deal with obsolescence more proactively. Lastly, as we've been trying to mobilize the DIB to support various efforts, I'm often asked, why can't we do what we did in World War II as described in the book Freedom's Forge? I gave a lecture each year on mobilization to the entire class at the National Defense University's Eisenhower School, and one of the slides I always presented was, why not Freedom's Forge? Where I outlined the conditions that were very different between what was happening, and Senator Reid mentioned one of those, and what is happening now that make it impossible to replicate that scenario. I'm happy to discuss these in further detail. I'll stop there by saying I appreciate the committee's leadership and focus on the strategic topic and in helping in any way I can. I have submitted written testimony for the record, and I thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Dr. Michienzi. Mr. Berteau, you are recognized for your opening statement.
Thank you, Senator Fisher, Senator Reid, and the committee. We really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. I am David Berteau. I'm the president and CEO of a trade association, the Professional Services Council. But I need to reflect for the record that I'm here today in my personal capacity, and the opinions and suggestions that I make today are my own and not those of my organization, who would otherwise be considered guilty. There's been a lot of talk about the World War II example of full-scale mobilization, and really in American history, we've really only had two such examples, the other one really being the Civil War. Old as I am, I was not alive to participate in World War II as part of that process, but my experience is actually in a different segment that's already been touched on a little, and that's the Cold War, and particularly the Reagan buildup during the Cold War. I arrived at the Pentagon in 1981, served there until 1993, and was very actively involved in a number of issues there. And there's a couple of lessons that I'd like to propose to you from that period of time that may be relevant to the discussion today. The first is that we actually had an operational plan and a scenario on which we could calculate what our mobilization requirements were. It was, in fact, Soviet tanks coming through the Fulda Gap in Germany and invading Europe. That was the driver. That was the thing that if we didn't prevail there, we'd go nuclear. And global thermonuclear war was clearly not an option we wanted to pursue, although we were prepared for that. How were we able to use that? We were able to build the requirements and actually secure the funding from the Congress because we had a common agreement between the White House, the Pentagon, and the Congress as to what the threat was we were facing and what the scenarios were on which we'd have to plan and be prepared to execute. So the first thing is we had that common ground. I don't think we have that today, and I think one of the most important things this committee can do is drive us to get that common understanding of what the scenario is. We had an operational plan, which is the fight today piece, and then we had a scenario, which is how that evolves over time. We need that in place today. The second lesson, and by the way, by being able to do that, we were able to propose funding for surge capacity, for war reserve spares, for training, for sustainment investments, for actually deploying and being able to show that we were able to do this. And the appropriators would give us that money because it was justified and everybody agreed on the basis for it. We don't have that today. An example of that, in fact, is when one of the lessons from Ukraine is the multi-year procurement for expanding munitions production capacity. The Pentagon's first submission to the Congress was decremented by a lot of the extra money that was going to go into building the multi-year procurements for many of those programs because there were higher priorities the committee had to achieve than to put those in place. Ultimately, that got fixed, but it took a long time to get agreement on that. So we have to have that agreed upon set of scenarios on which to base requirements. The second thing that we learned from that Cold War experience is the best way to deter was to demonstrate, not put on paper, but demonstrate that we had the capacity to deliver that. So every year we would have massive exercises where we'd literally deploy forces from the U.S. And sustain those forces in operations in Europe. Thousands and thousands of troops from all the NATO countries combined, clearly showing the Soviets that we could make it work. And that demonstrated capacity, I think, is the second key lesson. The third key lesson, been referred to a lot here, is the partnership with industry. And that partnership with industry is oftentimes an arm's length partnership. Dr. Michienzi did a good job of describing some of the flaws in that process. And I think that partnership has to include long-term contracts. It has to include stable design so you can maximize productions. That's one of the big advantages we actually had over Germany in World War II. Hitler and his team could not stop putting change orders into programs because new stuff would come along and they'd actually stop production in order to do it, whereas we would actually move those new ideas into the next iteration of different aircraft so we maximize production while still getting the benefits of new technology and research and development. And we did that throughout the war. The fourth lesson is the reliance on allies and partners. And Senator Reid, you mentioned Indo-PACOM and the China threat. You know, DOD uses the word the pacing challenge. I think it's actually much bigger than pacing, but it is the threat, but it's not the only threat. And I think a big difference between even the Cold War as well as World War II is the changing nature of the threat and the much more complex nature of that threat. Allies and partners are a key piece to this. And then the fifth lesson, I think, and we did not really learn this lesson very well during the Reagan buildup, is mobilization is much more than just defense and much more than defense industry. It's the whole nation. You mentioned workforce, sir, and we've got shortage of workers. We've kind of come out of that bathtub from COVID where we had twice as many vacant jobs as we had people looking for work. But throughout the industry, both at the production end and at the services and sustainment end, we've got a shortage of workers today that's continuing going forward there. So those are 5 lessons I think that would be useful for this committee to undertake. And my one suggestion to you is I think it's time, and I don't think you have time to wait. I think I would suggest that this committee Committee direct DOD to do between now and the time you go to conference a full-blown exercise of, say, what do our mobilization really requirements look like? What's the scenario on which we base that? You need that as a committee before you finalize the FY26 National Defense Authorization Act. With that, I'll got negative time to yield back, so I don't actually have any time to yield back, but I stand ready for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Berteau. We will have 5-minute rounds, and I will begin with questioning. I strongly believe the administration should maximize its use of the Defense Production Act. They have the authority to address challenges in our defense industrial base. However, I am concerned by the expanding definition of what qualifies as national defense. For example, in 2022, President Biden invoked the Defense Production Act to ramp up domestic production of clean energy technologies. Dr. McGinn, how should the Defense Production Act be used for defense mobilization? Should the DPA investments be focused on areas clearly related to the national defense of this country?
Thank you very much, Senator Fisher. Yes, the Defense Production Act is an incredibly powerful tool, and it is best used for national security defense purposes. And that's how it's been used during the development of the MRAP, during the Afghanistan-Iraq war. That's how it was used during COVID, and that's how it's being used to rebuild our defense industrial base in areas such as rare earth processing, castings and forgings, and the like, specialty chemicals. So that is how it is best used. And the more it is focused on national defense, it takes it off it is not a political issue, therefore it's a national security issue.
Thank you. And Dr. McGinn, how should the act be used for defense mobilization? Should the investments be focused on areas clearly related to being able to get that done? I'm sorry, Dr. Michienzi.
Thank you. I just wanted to make sure. Yeah, it should absolutely be focused on mobilization efforts, but some of the efforts that DPA is funding now, it's difficult sometimes to realize that those go towards mobilization. So things that Jerry mentioned, such as rare earth processing and critical chemicals
Would you look at any statutory changes to be able to make it work and make it identify truly what is national defense? Is there anything we need to be looking at here?
I mean, I think making sure that it is centered on national defense issues and national security is critically important, as Dr. McGinn mentioned, because we don't want to dilute the efforts of the DPA that are being very successfully used currently and can be used going forward.
Okay, thank you. Dr. McGinn, on January of 2024, the department released its first national defense industrial strategy, and later in October released an implementation plan. What's your assessment of the strategy?
Well, I think the strategy did a very good job at kind of bringing together a lot of efforts that have been led across recent administrations. One of the interesting things about this area is it's very bipartisan. There's been a lot of similar themes being addressed across the Obama administration, through the Trump administration first, through Biden and today. And I think that the strategy did a good job at identifying the progress that's been made, but also setting a vector for the future. And I think that there were a number of good things in that report. I particularly liked the focus on importance of production, as well as the importance of working with allies and partners. The key will be kind of how that's instantiated in the 26 budget submission.
Are there any additional areas that you'd recommend the department would consider that maybe were lacking from the previous strategies?
Yeah, I think two things I would recommend. One is mobilization. I mean, it's mentioned briefly in the strategy, but there's no talk about restarting kind of mobilization planning. I mean, there actually are program elements in the Army, Navy, and Air Force, Marines for mobilization, but they're really all about pre-positioning equipment and the like. There's no kind of planning function that's being done today. That all stopped, and that needs to be restarted. And then the other area is on the strategy. Talks a lot about it, building exportability in systems. That is, building systems so that we can share them with our partners and allies. That requires investment in terms of, because you're going to have different capability levels of different missiles going to different partners depending on how close they are. So that requires investment up front, and that needs to be, if that's a big priority, that needs to be invested in terms of making exportability a priority in acquisition, and also investing the technology needed to build that capability.
Okay, thank you. Senator Reid, you're recognized.
Well, thank you very much, Senator Fisher. First, let me commend you all on excellent testimony. Thank you. Thank you very much. Mr. Berteau, we've seen a lot of chaotic initiatives over the last several weeks, significant cuts of workforce. We've seen funding cuts that don't seem to be organized, and then we've tariffs in place on Canada and other countries who presumably we'd like to see work with us. Can you indicate or give an idea about the impact on these decisions and with respect to mobilization of our industrial base?
Senator, let me think out loud with you a little bit on that, because I don't have a prepared script to answer that question. Every administration, this is my 8th transition of one president to the next. My first one was President Carter to President Reagan. And every administration needs to and does undertake to make sure that the programs and projects across the federal government are in line with their priorities. And I think that's a lot of what's underpinning the efforts we've seen underway. It's being done differently than many have done, and one of the differences is stopping things while you're reviewing it rather than keep going while you're reviewing it. I think from a government-wide point of view, this has caused a bunch of hiccups, but more importantly, there's a second element of that review, and that is, don't just focus on the things you're going to stop, the money you're going to save, the reductions in workforce, unnecessary workforce that you're going to do, and so on. You also have to focus on where you want to not only keep going, but go further and faster. And I think one of the things that we're trying to focus on is what are those areas. Clearly, national security is a huge piece of that. Border security is another one. There's probably others that will emerge as part of that process. So I think my personal concern is that you need to actually undertake those places you're stopping or reducing or realtering, and keep in mind you need to be able to keep the capacity and capability and competence in the government contractor community to be able to work where you're going forward. That's the touchstone, I think, that I would advise this committee to look at it for. If I could add one thing on the DPA.
Yes, sir.
It's up for reauthorization this year. It's obviously not the jurisdiction of this committee. I've been through 2 DPA reauthorizations, including one in 1990 where we actually let the act expire under a veto threat because it got loaded up, Senator Fisher, as you indicated, with a bunch of things that didn't really, from our perspective, contribute to national defense. And we let the act expire. That's a dangerous time to do it. Saddam Hussein had just invaded Kuwait, and we sort of needed it, but it turned out there are other authorities we could use for a short-term conflict such as that. I do think this would be important, and input from this committee might be useful in that reauthorization in terms of looking not only at how the DPA has been used over the previous years, but how it's not been used and where you ought to do it. I agree with Dr. McGinn in terms of Title VII. DPA worked for me for a number of years. I exercised Title VII authority a number of times, and I think it really needs a refresh because the nature in which DOD would use that authority today in today's global economy is very different than it was in the 1980s. I'm sorry for that sidebar, but I think that's an important thing for you guys to
Thank
look
you,
at.
sir. Your comments, Dr. McGinn, and we're running out of time, so if you could, with respect to the present sort of turmoil that we're witnessing and the impact on the industrial base.
Well, the companies that support the government, play critical roles in lots of different functions, and so the big thing that I'm recommending is the importance of us restarting kind of mobilization planning. So that is not going to be impacted because it doesn't exist today. So that was something that has to be developed and is an inherently governmental function.
Thank you very much. Dr. Michienzi, we are much more reliant upon information technology and software-based systems today than we were certainly in World War II. and other periods of mobilization. When it comes to planning and preparing for industrial mobilization, how does this reliance change the situation?
Well, luckily, software and software systems have been, I would say, more adaptable than some of the hardware systems as DoD tries to move forward. So they do things like agile acquisition and refreshes and upgrades quite quickly. So I think software is absolutely key to any mobilization effort because that's what's controlling all of our command and control. For instance, C4ISR. So yeah, it's absolutely essential.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Reed. Senator Rounds, you are recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, thank you to all of you for being with us here today. We appreciate the time that you're taking from your schedules. For all of you, the fiscal year 2025 defense bill includes a provision from my office, Section 1074, a report on operational plans of the Department of Defense, which requires an assessment of the operational plans of the DoD in the event of multiple concurrent contingencies or protected conflicts. This requirement reflects the reality that in the event the U.S. engages in hostilities with China, other adversaries such as Russia and Iran will press their own advantage in Europe, the Middle East, and elsewhere. Basically talking about if we have a conflict, we're going to have a conflict on more than one area or one theater at a time. What are some of the considerations that we must take into account when talking about a multi-theater mobilization? And what are some of the key shortfalls that you believe the department should identify and highlight in their assessment? Dr. Berteau, would you like to begin?
Thank you, Senator. Let me again go back a few years. So, at the time of the Cold War, we really only had one set of scenarios that we cared about, and that was the Soviet threat in Europe. Everything else was considered to be what we called a lesser included case. That means whatever force structure and capability we'd have to counter the Soviet threat would probably be sufficient to counter any other threat. After the end of the Cold War, we changed that to several different iterations from a planning process point of view, including a two-war scenario, that essentially being the Middle East and Iran, Iraq, and the Korean Peninsula. It turns out after 9/11, we discovered that lesser included cases might be lesser, but they weren't included. And so we had to have a big shift in terms of both our strategy and our force posture to deal with that. In 2012, I was chartered by DoD to do the first assessment of what the force posture would be needed for the pivot to Asia. And what I discovered is there was no basis for that. And so it didn't fit. Again, this was a greater not included rather than a lesser included. And so I think if you look at that evolution over time, the request of your provision is a very valuable and timely request. But it's important to note that that's only where we are today. So, from the operational plan point of view, it really focuses from the combatant commander's point of view of if I have to fight today, if I have to fight tomorrow, what do I have, what do I do, how do I use it, how do I sustain it and support it, et cetera. I think it needs to be much broader than that of what is it in day 50? One of the lessons from Ukraine and almost every war we've entered in, it may look like it's going to be short at the beginning, it keeps on going. And so where are you at day 700? I think that's another element that is useful to add on there, sir.
Thank you. Dr. McGinn?
Thank you, Senator. Yes, thank you very much for that provision. I think that's important to really focus on the operational plannings. But one of the things that is missing in most operational planning is the role of industry. And so one of the things that we saw with supporting Ukraine is the challenge of production. That we've got to really kind of be able to ramp that up. And that requires really close government-industry collaboration. And we had that during the Cold War. We had these voluntary agreements that created integrating committees that were focused on the production of 155 munitions that were actually not, non-FACA boards that allowed for close collaboration between government and industry on production issues. And so we need to have, that needs to be part of the planning. We need to do the war games that have that, because you've seen the war games where if we have a Taiwan Strait scenario, we're out of Schlitz in 2 weeks on munitions, right? So we've got tremendous kind of industrial implications to these operational scenarios that have to be part of the planning going forward.
Thank you. Dr. Michienzi.
Real quickly, I'll just add that the National Defense Strategy drives how the Defense Department looks at operational planning. So the current national defense strategy says focus on China. Previous national defense strategies did include multiple conflicts at the same time and looking at that from an operational planning perspective. So, national defense strategy would be helpful here if we are going to really truly look at that. I do want to mention some of the impacts, though, are the types of munitions that we're going to use. In Ukraine, we're fighting mostly a ground war, so we're using a lot of artillery, mortars, things that we are absolutely not going to be using in a China fight. So in a China fight, we're focusing more on surface launched, air launched, long-range missiles. If we now have to add in another fight, say Korea, that we're back to a partial ground war. So it really matters which fights we're looking at as to which parts of the industrial base we're trying to ramp up.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Rounds. Senator King, you are recognized.
Madam Chair, congratulations on your meteoric rise to the chairmanship. Mr. Berteau, I was really interested in your approach during the Reagan years of defining the scenario and then defining the strategy to meet it. I can't believe isn't that what's done now? I would assume that's exactly what's done. Or is it being done in too broad a sense without focusing on particular scenarios that will require a particular response?
So I should probably clarify my use of the words, right? So you have an operational plan, which from my perspective and history is the today fight with the forces today in the theaters they're in. Scenarios can go beyond that, both in terms of time and in terms of geography. And what we had in the Cold War was almost no difference between the operational plan, the fight today, and what the long-term scenario would look like. Today, as we just heard in the discussion in response to Senator Rounds' question, we have a wide variety of potential conflicts that could arise. In addition, we've got
But still, shouldn't we, within that wide variety, we should try to choose the most likely? You can't just throw up your hands and say we have a very complex situation and therefore we can't have a specific response. Shouldn't we be saying, okay, this is the most likely scenario, and that's what we should be preparing for?
So I think you're right, sir. You need to figure out what you're going to base your requirements on and what you're going to spend your money on, right, and what comes first. You have to have a mechanism for prioritization. I think it's probably a combination of likelihood and probability, and I'm certainly not qualified to put those on there. But it's also a question of where's the greatest stressors and what are the vulnerabilities if we can't combine or meet those stressors. That could, in fact, require an integration across multiple scenarios to look at what's the aggregated or combined impact and effect, and where are the greatest things where we need to put our resources first. We will never have enough money to do everything.
Correct.
So the question is, where do you put it first?
The likelihood. A very quick, easy question for everybody. Can we all agree that continuing resolutions absolutely are not part of the solution to this problem?
Franklin Roosevelt did not face a single continuing resolution in the entire buildup to World War II and the execution thereof.
Yes, I concur.
All of you agree with that. And that's, of course, that's one of the difficulties that we're in now, and it creates all kinds of downstream effects with regard to the industrial base and preparation and everything else. Well, thank you for that. Let the record show continuing resolutions are not the way to do business, particularly in the defense area. All of you have mentioned something very interesting, which is allies are part of the solution. And it concerns me that we seem to be embarked on a course that at least is not encouraging to our allies, and in some cases is definitely poking our allies in the eye. Talk to me about the importance of allies in dealing with the production necessary for a significant conflict, whether it's Japan, the UK, Canada, or other countries.
So our allies' importance are a key part of our industrial base, and we have a number of agreements and collaborative programs. I mean, the largest fighter program in the world, the F-35, we have a dozen partner countries, I believe.
So we cannot do this by ourselves. Is that a fair answer?
That's correct. That's correct.
All of you are nodding. Could you say yes, because nods don't show up in the record?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. Nods don't show up in the transcript.
Exactly. Thank you. One of the problems is the consolidation within the defense industrial base. How do we go about expanding the options available One suggestion we had from one witness earlier was to go to major manufacturing facilities, Ford Motor Company, for example, and getting them engaged in military production as well as making F-150s. How do we expand the industrial base? Everybody comes here and says we need to expand the industrial base. Give me some practical suggestions as to how that might happen. Go ahead.
Senator, it's a great question. And I think, one, we have to recognize the consolidation industrial base that people talk about, it's largely a function of spending. During the Cold War, during the 80s, when Mr. Berteau was in the Pentagon, we were spending 5.5%, 6% of GDP. Now we're spending around 3%. So you're going to have less companies, in the overall ecosystem. And then, as something that Dr. Michienzi mentioned, is that when your acquisition is focused on efficiencies, you want to buy the right system for the right time, and then what that ends up with is very limited production runs and/or very production runs that last for, when you have platform programs like the F-35, the Bradley fighting vehicle, the Abrams tank, they last for 40 years. And so you have a prime contractor that has that market position. So my argument is that to change the dynamic, we have to change how we buy, which means buying more systems, buying from multiple sources, and you can do that very much. You can do that very much with unmanned systems, with some of the platform systems. You can do that as well. There's been a lot of work done on second sourcing back in the 70s and 80s, where we're buying munitions from 2 suppliers, and that reduces costs. So there are ways you can increase competition by changing your buying approach. And that has to get away from some of the efficiency focus and more on what capabilities and capacities do we need.
And one of the particular things that ought to be part of this is modularity, so that you can upgrade without having to upgrade the entire platform. Ms. Michienzi, is that correct?
Madam Chair, would you indulge me for one sentence? We just don't buy enough to keep more companies in business. We just don't buy enough. The reason we only have 2.5 manufacturers of tactical missiles is we only buy enough to keep 2.5 companies in business.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator King. Senator Sheehy, you are recognized.
Thanks for appearing today. Mr. Berteau, you talked about, the World War II construct, obviously, with regard to revisioning of product specifications and how we evolve that. I share the same concern, though, with regard to the customer has created this problem. The government, the Pentagon has created this defense consolidation and the brittle supply chain we have. And I'm not confident that the government can be the solution to it either. How do we incentivize the industry, free market solutions, to actually create a resilient and diversified supply chain, rebuild the industrial base in a way that's resilient for a sustained conflict? Because, during World War II, Japan and Germany had a very centralized defense acquisition ministry, specified everything from on high, and tried to control the entire process from A to Z. And that worked very well early on, but it couldn't keep up with the sheer quantity required, and there is a certain amount of quality in quantity. So that strength for us came from the free market. It came from private companies working in coordination, of course, with the government. But how do we take a defense base that has largely been atrophied to the point of almost non-existence for quantity-level manufacturing, and how do we incentivize the free market to outpace the government in fixing this solution?
Thank you, Senator. There's 2 ways to approach that. And when I got to the Pentagon, there's this famous chart of we went from 51 prime contractors down to 5. When I got to the Pentagon, all 51 were there. Why did they go away? During a buildup in which we were doubling the size of procurement and research and development expenditures in DOD. They went away for 3 reasons. Number one is, even with those more dollars, there wasn't more quantity to buy. Second is, we began to put more and more regulations on top, the compliance regulations. I'm working on, and I'll be glad to provide it to the committee when I'm finished this, a comparison of the compliance requirements that a government contractor has, not just defense contractors, but any government contractor, and what happens in the private sector. And it's a list of at least 15 or 20 things that cost more, take time, and don't really improve results, in my opinion. And I think that's an important piece of it as well. Ford Aerospace, Fairchild Industries, Sperry, Burroughs, GM, they all went out of the defense business in the middle of the buildup because it was no longer, two things, it was no longer time value money in the private sector is way different than the time value money in DOD. So the returns weren't there. The opportunities for better returns elsewhere were there. So you have to be able to counter that with government policies and programs that offset that risk-reward basis that the financial market's always looking for. And I think that can be done, but that's not the path we're on right now.
So for any of you who choose to answer then, how does the government remove the bureaucratic red tape that really creates a sclerosis in the acquisition chain that disincentivizes companies from wanting to do business with the Pentagon, that disincentivizes companies from that we don't have to have SpaceX and Palantir sue the government to buy a solution that's better for the warfighter. And that's what's been going on. A better solution can be sitting on the shelf, but since it doesn't comport with a dizzying array of Byzantine regulations, either it's not purchased or that company has to sue the government to give the warfighter the equipment they need. Now, how do we change those regulations quickly, internally, so people want to do business and want to support the warfighter?
Great question, Senator. I would start, again, what's unique about the government contracting system is, it's a monopsony. You have one buyer or different sets of buyers, and, so it creates different dynamics. They can set the market. So the power is in the hands of the government or the Department of Defense to change incentive structures, because companies, private companies, public companies, they respond to incentives. And so the onus is on the department to change those incentive structures, and Congress can help here. And a couple of ways that we can do that, that will create more opportunities for companies across the spectrum, is to to bring the power of our capital system that you allude to bear. And because if we want to build factories in advance of need, that can be done through the government investing. But, we're not going to be doing any more big CHIPS bills, that kind of government investment. But if you incentivize companies and create offtake agreements or financing programs that enable them to make a bet at below market rates, like the Department of Energy has, and builds off what the Office of Strategic Capital is doing, that is how you get lots of money, which is the private equity and venture capital money to invest. And that will help build capacity and build competitors for the department.
Can I just add one quick thing? I think there also needs to be a recognition of risk acceptance in the department. Contracting officers are personally liable for, something goes wrong with the contracting. Program managers are promoted if they produce things and nothing goes wrong. So there is a very low risk tolerance in the department, and I think that contributes to the fact of not introducing new suppliers, not wanting to change things, not wanting to, bring in new industries. So I think there needs to be that piece of it that accounts for it as well.
Well, thank you. Quantity, iteration, and speed are key. And, what won World War II for us wasn't the capability of our technology. It was our ability to build lots of things fast and get in the hands of our warfighters. So we got to get back to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Sheehy. Senator Kane, you are recognized.
Thank you, Senator Fisher, and thanks to our witnesses. My concern about mobilization is heavily on the workforce side, and I think maybe because I'm on the health, education, labor, pension, I look at a lot of things through this workforce angle. But also in my dialogue with our shipbuilders and ship repairs in Virginia and elsewhere, I'm very, very nervous about us not having the workforce we need. And I think this is sort of a long-term problem with birth rates declining, and they're not going to change immediately. And if they did, we wouldn't see it for 25 years. So I think there's some big picture solutions like immigration, a workforce-based immigration reform that we're going to have to grapple with to get this right. But I'd love it if each of you could just address workforce strategies to help us with mobilization, and maybe even include workforce strategies that we can do jointly with allies. And I'll start with Mr. Berteau, because I know you talked about workforce in your opening statement.
Thank you, Senator Kane. a lot of what we've already talked about has an impact on that, but I think there's two additional points that I'd like to make here. One is, in fact, the impact of COVID and both the inflation in general costs and the increase in costs of labor over the last 5 years. Many defense companies and many other contractors in the rest of the federal government have bids that were put in place, accepted by the government, and contracts currently underway that made assumptions about 0% interest rate, very low inflation, a balance between job vacancies and those seeking for work, so a stable workforce, low unemployment. None of that is true over the last 5 years. Many of those contracts have not been adjusted. In fact, DoD is still issuing contracts today with an annual inflation clause of somewhere around 1 or 1.2%. Both for workforce, for wages and benefits, and for other costs associated with that. That's not only unrealistic, it leads companies to bid proposals that are unexecutable in the end. What have we done about that? This committee actually put some language in a couple of years ago in the NDAA, I think it's 3 years ago now, that gave the Defense Department the flexibility where funds were available to offset some of those costs. We've seen very little effort on the part of the Defense Department to look at those economic price adjustments come into play. What's the result? You know this. You've got a starting welder salary at a shipyard, or even after a year of experience, that's substantially less than what that person can make at Walmart or Costco. Not standing out in the cold or the heat, and welding's an honorable profession, but it's hard work. Now, I'm not saying that being a warehouseman at Costco is not hard work, but it's a lot easier on the body. So we've got to offset some of that, or else we're never going to climb out of this hole.
Could I ask Dr. McGinn and Dr. Michienzi?
Yes, thank you very much, Senator. I think one of the strengths of the workforce, the defense industrial base workforce, is the nature of the business. And unlike commercial industries, we generally have longer-term contracts, 5-year contracts, or 1 year with 4 options that enables stability in the workforce. It enables companies to plan for the future. However, when you have continuing resolutions, to use as Senator King mentioned, and you have stability in budget, it makes it harder for companies to do that. So the more that Congress and the department can create stable demand signals, and that's through things like I mentioned, if you do purchase commitments for certain technology, certain capabilities that you need, or you do multi-year procurement contracts, that enables kind of the stability to grow and stabilize workforce.
Great. And Dr. Michienzi, you've got 1:15, but the chair may let you go just a little bit longer.
Okay, thank you. It's a great question, and I've been involved in this very much as we have been scaling up production for Ukraine and other obstacles. The quickest way to scale up is to increase capacity if you aren't already operating at full scale, right? But you need people for that. And it was always an issue to get the people, even if you had excess capacity, getting people to come on board to, absorb that excess capacity was difficult. A lot of it has to do with areas that these plants are located in. By design, they're in rural kind of, areas that are not near, exciting cities, and so young people don't want to move there. So I think, things that can build infrastructure and make those places better for young people and make them want to go there and want to stay would be helpful. It also goes to, when we were growing up, we wanted our kids all to be engineers, right? Not technicians. That wasn't considered a valued job description. So we need to make being a technician exciting, and there are some efforts in the department to do that. But make sure that they understand that what they're doing is important. It goes direct to the warfighter, et cetera. And lastly, for allies, I've done a lot of work in that area. I was the lead for the Guided Weapons Explosive Ordnance program with Australia. And one of the things that we had proposed was, as they were trying to ramp up their capacity to make munitions in Australia, which they haven't done in a long time, bring some of their folks over to train here and fill some of the workforce shortages that we had here. So it's a win-win. So that's, something that we should pursue.
Which is sort of what we're doing with AUKUS a little bit. We have Aussie shipbuilders and sailors here training with us so they can go back and do the same thing.
Right, but we need to do more.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thanks, Senator Fisher.
Thank you, Senator Kane. At this time, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to enter Chairman Wicker's prepared statement into the record. This concludes today's hearing. I'd like to thank the witnesses for their testimony, and we are adjourned.